A very common question, especially when you're a newer stitcher, is where to start stitching. What area to stitch first versus another area. And that's a really good question. And what I always ask myself is, are there going to be stitches that need to sit physically on top of other stitches? If so, I would do the underneath stitches first and then do the top stitches second. That is one way to determine. For this particular design, except for one place, we're looking at the words versus the plants. And so it doesn't necessarily matter if you did all the plants first and then did the words, again, except for one place. I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But I just wanted to start on the words because I just was inspired to do the words first. That one place that I keep talking about is right here. This is the only place on this design where the plants will be on top of the words, this little this string of pearls right here. So obviously, regardless of the rest of it, you will need to stitch the G before you do the string of pearls. But what I'm starting with is the entire word, so that we're good there. So that's how to determine which to do first. Now that we've decided to do the word first, we have to decide which part of each letter to stitch first. And there is a reason here. I am doing I'm going to call it the offset. You know, the underneath part of the letter where it looks like the letter's been stretched, and the part that's, you know, stretches out behind the letter, the top letter, the white part. And it's this part right here. So I'm going to stitch that first, and then I'm going to stitch the white outline on top. Why? You know, you could probably, I think it would probably be fine if you wanted to stitch the outline first and then stitch the colors underneath it. You would just have to be careful that when you were doing the satin stitch, you know, up next to this white stitching, that you put your needle under that white outline. I am doing the colors first so that when I stitch the white outline, it can sit on top of the colors, the oranges and the pinks. That just makes it a little bit easier when, you know, I don't have to be so precise and careful about how neat my satin stitching is on this side, the side that's going to be covered. I do have to be neat with it on this side. So now that I've mentioned satin stitching, let's talk about the satin stitching to fill in the offsets. Satin stitching is a very popular stitch, is a very frequently used stitch. It has lots of uses, great as a filling stitch, obviously. And you know, while it's not a technically difficult stitch, it's not like some stitches that have like 4 or 5 steps to create the stitch. It's really just straight stitches right next to each other. That's all it is. But there are a few things that help to make it look nicer when you are working on it and make it a little bit less frustrating. I keep saying this, but I have a whole very long, very detailed video tutorial that's all about satin stitching. So if you have never done satin stitching, or if you have done it and have found it frustrating before because it just didn't turn out pretty or smooth, or you struggled with it, I would definitely recommend going to watch that entire video. I'm going to give you some tips here, and there will be some of the same things. So I don't want to make you rewatch that whole, and make everyone rewatch that whole video right now. So go search that out if you would like. But let's talk about the satin stitching here. I am going to use 2 strands. And right off the bat, the most important thing, or one of the most important things I can tell you to make your satin stitching better, is how you separate these strands. And that is, the method I use is called stripping threads. Now again, if you have never heard of this, there's a whole video tutorial on it. It's not a long one, but it's there. I'm trying to find a piece of thread that I can show you quickly how to strip a thread. But here is, you know, for years I separated strands of thread by pulling them apart like that. I hated that method. That method drove me nuts because the threads twisted back on each other if you didn't keep them apart, and there was a big knot. And if I needed 2 strands and I pulled 2 away from the other 4, and those 2 strands never laid very nicely on the fabric. When you strip threads, here's how to do it. Here's the quick version. Hold the threads between these 2 fingers, or 2 fingers, separate a strand, pull it. As you pull up, Let me get that so you can see it. See how that thread is twisting up on itself, but when I pull that all the way out, it pops back, and that other thread, all you have to do is just run your fingers down it, and it's not knotted, it's just sort of spiraled up on itself. And now I have one strand of thread. I lay this on my table, I do the same thing, I hold the threads, pull one more strand out. It's pre-cut. I've already cut the lengths. You know, the length I cut it is about a yard. If that's too long for you, cut it shorter, but cut whatever length of thread you want to use and then pull it out that way. Then, so anyway, pull the second strand, lay it, where'd that one go? Come here. All right, then I lay it next to this one. I match up the ends like that, and then I run my fingers, I run the 2 or however many strands. Come here, you, behave. All right, got a little bit of a twisty knot down there, but okay. I run my fingers down these threads several times to sort of line them up, and that right there, having the however many strands laying next to each other as opposed to being twisted together is what will improve your satin stitch. You don't want to put little twisty ropes of thread next to each other. You want to put individual strands next to each other. So that's what makes it look nice and smooth and silky, satiny. So that's the quickie version of the thread stripping tutorial. All right, so 2 strands. Because this pattern already has the divisions for where each color goes, it already sort of has built-in guidelines. Putting guidelines in each section will help you to maintain the angle while you're stitching. If for some reason you want some more guidelines, that's perfectly fine. You might want to consider a different color of marker so you don't get it confused with, you know, this is the, oh, it's with my Frixion marker. You know, this is the division between the dark orange and light orange. If I want to put guidelines between, you know, inside the light orange section, then I would perhaps use a different color like that, or make them lighter or whatever. Maybe if I had a black pen, I could do that. You might not need extra guidelines on this since they're pretty small sections, but you can always add them. Now let's get to satin stitching, actually stitching. I have yammered on enough. So satin stitching is about precision. Anytime I'm doing any kind of satin stitching, I always make sure, oh, totally forgot the first step that I want to do. Okay, back up. I want to, you don't have to do this for every time you satin stitch, but I am going to do it here. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to put a little split back stitch outline along part of this line over which I am going to stitch. Now I'm going to zoom in here, so I'll be right back. Gosh, sorry about that. Totally got ahead of myself. I just wanted to get right to the satin stitching, but I completely forgot about this step. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be putting a split back stitch outline along one edge, and I don't want to put it all the way from here all the way to here. Because these stitches are going to be at this angle, the lines that delineate, that show each section, that's the angle my stitches are going to be. They're all going to be that angle. And I don't need to put an outline right here because there's going to be a stitch going that direction. And I don't want to have to try to cover that outline. So I'm going to start it right here. Ignore this little interior line. Just forget about that, okay? I'm going to start right here, and I'm going to stitch right on top of my pattern line until I get to about right there. Why am I stitching right on the pattern line? Because when I come to do my satin stitching, I want to be able to bring my needle up outside, like just outside that edge, and take the stitch over the split back stitch. And if I do it on the inside, like where this little line is, then you might have some of this pattern line showing. Remember how I said I try to be real careful about completely covering these lines? That's what I'm doing here. It seems like a little minor detail, but I try really hard to, when I start a stitch, I come up just outside the actual pattern line. So I am using 2 strands of the pink thread. It doesn't really matter what color you use because you're going to be covering it up. I just chose this medium pink color, so I'm going to start about right here, come up right on the pattern line, and do a split back stitch. Like this. This does not have to be super neat because it is going to be covered up. It's just giving you a nice, it gives you a nice edge when you are satin stitching, and it kind of helps you have a little bit of a cleaner edge. It raises it up just a teeny bit. Now I am making these stitches really short. For all of this outline type stitching, because these are curves, I am making sure that my stitches are pretty short. My rule is always the tighter the curve, the shorter the stitch, but I'm just making all of these pretty short. Like I said, it is going to be covered, so it doesn't have to be pretty. You don't have to use split back stitch. You can use split stitch. You could use just a back stitch if you wanted to. Really, whatever your favorite kind of line stitch that's quick and easy for you is going to work just fine. It's just to sort of delineate, like I said, where the edge of that satin stitch is going to be, and it gives it a slightly neater edge. So I'm almost to the point where I said I would stop. Let me get up there. And there will be a diagram in the instructions, so make sure you look at that about if you're a little confused about where to stop and like why I started here and stopped here. There's going to be a diagram that's going to show you exactly where to stitch these split backstitch outlines on each of the letters. So if you can't quite figure out where to put them, just look at that diagram. Okay, there's my outline. Now I can start satin stitching. All right, here we go. Actual real life pretty stitching. A tip for satin stitching. It seems like every time I start the very first stitch, it's a little more twisted than I want it to be. Remember how I went to all that trouble to separate the strands so they're sitting next to each other? They're always a little bit twisted because this thread has not been pulled through the fabric over and over and over, which helps those strands get really nice and, you know, smooth. So here's what I do almost every time I start the first stitch for satin stitching. I've come through, I have the knot on the back, I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to pull it up, and on the back I am pulling with these fingers so that I can kind of pull it through the fabric a little bit at the same time that I am taking my needle and running it back and forth, and that helps those strands to, I'm going to pull down as I pull the needle out, and now they lay more smoothly. That's what I'm doing, is I'm using my needle as a laying tool. There's a tool you can buy, but I've always just used my needle. If you want to get the tool, that works great too. But my needle's right here in my hand. I don't have to go searching for another tool, and I use it like that. The other thing you can do that method anywhere along here. You know, I will frequently use my needle like that to straighten out some strands that are kind of get twisted as I'm stitching. This first stitch, the other thing you can do on the back, I am grabbing the little knot, and can you see I'm sort of seesawing that thread back and forth. I'm pulling on the knot, and then on the other side I'm pulling it back and forth. You see that? And then I pull it again, and that will also straighten out those strands. This is for the first stitch only, obviously, because you can't pull other stitches back and forth. All right, first stitch. That one took forever. So much talking. Now I am going to do my actual satin stitching. Whew. Now I've come up to that line that I stitched. All of these stitches are going to sit parallel to each other, making sure at the top that I go ahead and I get right up to that line that's going to be covered with the white stitching. When I come up on the bottom side, I make sure I'm coming up right next to this stitched line. I don't want to split those stitches. I don't want the needle to come up through the split back stitching. I want it to go over the edge, and so sometimes it takes just a second. You don't want to be, far out like that, and you don't want to be on this side of it, and you don't want to come up through it. Do you see how the needle came up through that stitching? Not what I want it to do. I want it to be right next to it. Keeping in mind my angle, that's the angle I'm shooting for each section. And if your angle gets a little bit off, it's okay. If it gets wildly off, you might want to take out a stitch or two and kind of get back on track. If it's just one stitch that gets a little wonky, sometimes I just move on and I course correct on the next stitch. I did a pretty good job on this section of making my angles good. Also, if you put one a little too far over and there's a space of fabric, if there's a nice even space, you can fill it, go back and fill it in. Sometimes I just take out that last stitch and just start over. All right, there's my first section. Another tip for satin stitch after you get it all done is I take my fingernail or my finger and I kind of just rub it over in the direction of the satin stitching, and it kind of smushes those fibers together and it makes it look a little bit nicer. Sometimes they just aren't quite working together too well, but that usually seems to help make them look really nice and shiny. So now I can move on to the next color. Next up is the lighter color of orange, and I am going to talk about something here, and hopefully I can blather on and stitch well at the same time. Doesn't always work out that way, but let me talk to you about, and I just did a whole Instagram reel about this. Sometimes, especially if I haven't satin stitched in a while and I sit down to do it, even though I have done a ton of satin stitching in my time, if it's been a while and I sit down to satin stitch again, often it takes me a while to find that rhythm for my brain and my hands and my eyes, to find the rhythm, and for my hands and the threads and the needle to come up where it needs to come up and the threads to lay down the way I want them to lay down. Sometimes it just doesn't happen. Here's an example. See this R right here? I did that before I did the G, and I just struggled. Man, I can't tell you how many times I did a section and I took it out, or I put a stitch in and it just didn't go well, and oh boy, man, it had been a long time since I satin stitched, and these areas really hard for me. I was glad to get that R done. By the time I moved over to this G, let me move over here. By the time I moved over to the G, it's like it clicked again. I had found my rhythm again. I had gotten back into it. So my point is, sometimes it's not about how many times you've done it or how much skill you have with it. Sometimes if it's just not working, don't beat yourself up about it. It just takes a little bit of time, and other artists have said the same thing. It's not really even about just stitching. It's painting, it's anything. It just takes a little bit of repetition to fall back into that rhythm where everything just falls into place. So don't beat yourself up if you sit down and you start to do satin stitching and you think, nothing's going right. I can't get the stitches. I'm bringing the needle up in the wrong place and putting it down in the wrong place, and the stitches aren't laying flat. That has happened to me. It happened to me in the past couple of days. So don't tell yourself, well, I'm just horrible at satin stitch. I just can't do it. That's not the case. You really sometimes just have to keep at it. If you want to maybe have a practice hoop somewhere off to the side, that if it's not going well on the real thing, pull out a practice hoop and just do some stitches to get yourself back in the swing of things. And I think you'll find that your hands and your brain and your eyes will start to work together. So don't automatically just assume that you are horrible at satin stitch, because the minute you start it, or even if you come back to it after a while, it doesn't look great, because I think you'll get there. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of repetition. Lo and behold, by some kind of miracle, I was able to prattle on and stitch that section at the same time, and it actually turned out pretty good. That just doesn't always happen, trust me. What I will do now is I will finish filling in the pink and the light pink, and I'll do this section. I'll put my split back stitch in and fill in this section with the satin stitch, and then we'll move on. The white outline that we're going to put on top here is just a simple, again, just the same split back stitch. This time I am using 3 strands of white thread, and I bumped it up to 3 strands because I wanted to have a little bit more bulk. And really the only thing to keep in mind here is the length of your stitches. And remember I mentioned shorter curves, shorter stitches. Well, the O does not have really, well, there's tight curves right here. There's a tight curve here and there's a tight curve here. Otherwise, the curves are pretty gentle, but I know that on particularly the R and sections of the G and over here in the, up in here on the W, these are really, really tiny curves, and I'm going to make my stitches really, really tiny. Like when I make this little curve right here, there's going to be like a stitch here and a little tiny one here and a little tiny one here, so that it really reads like a curve and not a point. Therefore, I don't want to necessarily have really long stitches on the O and really short stitches on the W. Plus, I just tend to generally kind of have smaller stitches. It's just that if you have long stitches, it looks like more like a jagged line than a smooth curved line. The other thing is to just make it right along the edge of the satin stitching that you did earlier. Other than that, that is all there is to these white outlines. French knots give each of these letters a little finishing touch, just a little pop of that bright white color. And as you are probably expecting, I already have a separate video tutorial about French knots. So if you have never done them or struggle with them, definitely go watch that. But I will give you the very quick version right here. I am using 3 strands, just like I did for the outline, so the same white thread. You are going to come up and make sure, even if you're familiar with French knots, you might not have heard a little tip I'm going to give you in just a second. So stick with me here for a second. Let me just show you the basic how to. Come up, hold the thread with the other hand, wrap around. This time for these, so these center ones are going to be wrapped twice. The knots on either side of the main center knot are going to be wrapped once. So I've come up, wrap once. It doesn't matter if you wrap this way or, towards you or away from you. Just be consistent. I wrap away from myself. I keep a little bit of tension here, but I'm not pulling on it super tight. I don't want to choke up on that needle too much, but I'm going to hold it back a little bit. I'm going to put the needle down. Here's the first place that people really mess up French knots, is they try to put the needle back down right where they came up. You do not want to do that because you'll just pull the knot all the way to the back. Put the needle down right next to, just one little fiber away from where you came up. But before you do anything else, very gently pull that thread down so that it lies, you pull it towards the fabric so it's laying up against the fabric like that. All right, now I keep a little bit of tension here, and now I can push that needle through. I usually keep a finger right there as I pull through. Sometimes the thread can get twisted and knot up right there, and there's your perfect little French knot. Let me do that again. This time I'm going to wrap 2 times, but here's the tip. All right, so remember how I said when you come up, and then when you go down over just even a tiny, tiny little bit, like one little fabric fiber over. But the fact is, sometimes French knots, it doesn't matter if they're a little bit over here or a little bit over here. Like if you're making like a field of moss or the center of a flower, and you're just piling a bunch of French knots, doesn't matter. These, the placement really is important. You don't want this center knot to be too high up or too low or off to the right or the left. So I want to be really precise. In order to do that, I am not going to come up right smack on my dot. If I come up right in the center of that dot, make my knot, and then move over a hair, a fiber to make that knot, well, now that knot is shifted just a little bit to whichever side you go over to. Therefore, when I come up, I'm going to come up, hopefully you can you see that right there? I know it's tiny. I have come up just, literally just one little fiber, not in the center of my dot that marks my placement. So I've come up just to the side. I tend to come up a little bit diagonally and to the right because I know when I put my needle down, I put it down diagonally. Anyway, excuse me. So come up. I've come up a little off center. This one, wrap twice. 1, 2. Now go down. Now I can take the needle down right on top of that dot. And when I pull that thread down, now my knot is dead center over the little dot for the placement. So I'll show you one more time. Even for these little bitty ones, I'm just going to barely come up to the side. This one's wrap one time, go down, pull that thread gently towards the fabric, hold the thread and pull through. The other thing about French knots is I know sometimes new stitchers will ask, do you make a knot, knot it on the back, make a French knot, knot it on the back, cut, go to the next one? You can do that. And in some ways that's safer. If what I tend to do is I do a knot and I jump to here. I mean, I don't jump from here and then like over here to make a knot. I mean, I have, but generally I don't. If it's close by, I just move across. The only issue with that is that, you know, sometimes no matter how many times you've done a French knot, you've done thousands of them, they will mess up on you. And if you mess up this one and you have to cut it out, you may need to cut out all the ones you've done in a line or cut back a little bit. So that's the only thing, not a big deal. But I just jump from here to here to here. And you know, I'm gonna go ahead and jump across to here. I have plenty of thread on my needle. So that one is wrap once. This one is wrap twice. And you know, the stripping your threads also helps with French knots. Using threads that are strands that are parallel to each other will help your French knots be a little bit less prone to snarling up. And this one is wrap once. So that was your little mini lesson on French knots. And once you add the French knots, each letter is finished.